1984 by George Orwell. Chapter 1. It was a bright, cold day in April. The clocks were striking 13. Winston Smith, his chin nuzzled into his breast, in an effort to escape the vile wind, slipped quickly through the glass doors of Victory Mansions, though not quickly enough to prevent a swirl of gritty dust from entering along with him. The hallway smelt of boiled cabbage and old rag mats. At one end of it, a colored poster, too large for indoor display, had been tacked to the wall. It depicted simply an enormous face, more than a meter wide, the face of a man of about 45, with a heavy black mustache and ruggedly handsome features. Winston made for the stairs. It was no use trying the lift. Even at best at times, it was seldom working, and at present the electric current was cut off during daylight hours. It was part of the economy drive in preparation for Hate Week. The flat was 7 flights up, and Winston, who is 39, had varicose ulcer above his right ankle, went slowly, resting several times along the way. On each landing, opposite of the lift shaft, the poster with an enormous face gazed from that of the wall. It was one of those pictures which are so contrived that eyes follow you when you move. Big Brother is watching you, the caption beneath it ran. Inside the flat, a fruity voice was reading out a list of figures which had something to do with the production of pig iron. The voice came from an oblong metal plaque like a dulled mirror which formed part of the surface of the right-hand wall. Winston turned a switch, and the voice sank somewhat through the words were still distinguishable. The instrument, the telescreen it was called, could be dimmed, but there was no way of shutting it off completely. He moved over to the window. A smallish, frail figure, the meagerness of his body merely emphasized by the blue overalls, which were the uniform of the party. His hair was very fair, his face naturally sanguine, his skin roughened by coarse soap and blunt razor blades, the cold of the winter that had just ended. Outside, even through the shut window pane, the world looked cold. Down the street little eddies of wind were whirling dust and torn paper into spirals. Even though the sun was shining in the sky a harsh blue, there seemed to be no color in anything except the posters that were plastered everywhere. The black mustachioed face gazed down from every commanding corner. There was one on the house immediately opposite. Big Brother is watching you, the caption said, while the dark eyes looked deep into Winston's own. Down at street level, another poster, torn at one corner, flapped fitfully in the wind, alternatively covering and uncovering the single word, Ingsoc. In the far distance, a helicopter skimmed down between the roofs, hovered for an instant like a blue bottle, and darted away again with a curving flight. It was the police patrol, snooping into people's windows. The patrols did not matter, however, only the thought police mattered. Behind Winston's back, the voice from the telescreen was still babbling away about pig iron and the overfulfillment of the 9th 3-year plan. The telescreen received and transmitted simultaneously any sound that Winston made above level of a very low whisper would be picked up by it. Moreover, so long as he remained within the field of vision which the bare metal plaque commanded, he could be seen as well as heard. There was no way of knowing whether you were being watched at any given moment. How often or on what system the thought police plugged in on any individual wire was guesswork. It was even conceivable that they watched everybody all the time. But at any rate, they could plug in your wire whenever they wanted to. You had to live, did live from habit, that came instinct. In the assumption that every sound you made was overheard except in darkness, every movement scrutinized. Winston kept his back turned to the telescreen. It was safer, though, as he well knew, even a bat can be revealing. A kilometer away, the Ministry of Truth, his place of work, towered vast and white above the grimy landscape. This, he thought, with a sort of vague distaste, was London, chief city of Airstrip 1. Itself the third most populous of the provinces of Oceania. He tried to squeeze out some childhood memory that should tell him whether London had always been quite like this. Were there always these vistas of rotting 19th century houses, their sides shored up with bulks of timber, their windows patched with cardboard, and their roofs corrugated with iron, their crazy garden walls sagging in all directions, and the bomb sites where the plaster dust swirled in the air and the willow herb straggled over the leaps of rubble, and a place where the bombs had cleared a larger path and there had sprung up sordid colonies of wooden dwellings like the chicken houses. But it was no use. He could not remember. Nothing had remained of his childhood except a series of bright-lit tableaus, occurring against no background and mostly unintelligible. The Ministry of Truth, Min-Truth in Newspeak, was startlingly different from any other object in sight. It was an enormous pyramidal structuring of glittering white concrete, soaring up terrace after terrace, even 300 meters into the air. From where Winston stood, it was just possible to read, picked out on his own white face, in elegant lettering, the three slogans of the party: war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. The Ministry of Truth contained, it was said, 3,000 rooms above ground level, and corresponding ramifications below. Scattered about London, there were just 3 other buildings of similar appearance and size. So completely did they dwarf the surrounding architecture that from the roof of Victory Mansions you could see all 4 of them simultaneously. They were homes of the 4 ministries, between which the entire apparatus of government was divided. The Ministry of Truth, which concerned itself with the news, entertainment, education, and fine arts; the Ministry of Peace, which concerned itself with war; the Ministry of Love, which maintained law and order; and the Ministry of Plenty, which was responsible for economic affairs. Their names: Mini-True, Mini-Pax, Mini-Love, and Mini-Plenty in Newspeak. The Ministry of Love was the really frightening one. There were no windows on it at all. Winston had never been inside. The Ministry of Love, nor within half a kilometer of it, was a place impossible to enter, except on official business, and then only by penetrating through a maze of barbed wire and entanglements and steel doors and hidden machine gun nests. The streets leading up to its outer barriers were roamed by gorilla-faced guards in black uniforms, armed with jointed truncheons. Winston turned around abruptly. He had set his features into the expression of quiet optimism, which it was advisable to wear when facing the telescreen. He crossed the room into the tiny kitchen. By leaving the ministry at this time of the day, he had sacrificed his lunch in the canteen. He was aware that there was no food in the kitchen except a hunk of dark-colored bread, which had gotten saved for tomorrow's breakfast. He took down from the shelf a bottle of colorless liquid in a plain white label labeled Victory Gin. It gave off a sickly, oily smell as of Chinese rice spirit. Winston poured out nearly a teacupful, nerved himself for a shock, and gulped it down. And instantly, like a dose of medicine. Instantly, his face turned scarlet and the water ran out of his eyes. The stuff was like nitric acid. Moreover, in swallowing it, one had the sensation of being hit on the back of the head with a rubber club. The next moment, however, the burning in his belly died down, and the world began to look more cheerful. He took a cigarette from a crumpled packet marked Victory Cigarettes, and incautiously held it upright, whereupon the tobacco fell out onto the floor. With the next he was more successful. He went back into the living room and sat down at a small table that stood to the left of the telescreen. From the table drawer he took out a pen holder and a bottle of ink, and a thick quarto-sized blank book with a red back and marbled cover. For some reason, the telescreen in the living room was in an unusual position. Instead of being placed, as was normal, at the end wall, where it could command the whole room, it was in the longer wall, opposite to the window. One side of it, there was a shallow alcove, in which Winston was now sitting, which, when the flats were built, had probably been intended to hold bookshelves. By sitting in the alcove, keeping well back, Winston was able to remain outside the range of the telescreen. So far as sight went, he could be heard, of course, but so long as he stayed within his present position, he could not be seen. It was partially the unusual geography of the room that suggested him the thing that he was now about to do. But it had also been suggested by the book that he had just shaken out the drawer. It was a peculiarly beautiful book. Its smooth, creamy paper, a little yellowed by age, was of a kind that had not been manufactured for at least 40 years past. He could guess, however, that the book was much older than that. He had seen it lying in the window of a frowsy little junk shop in a slummy quarter of town. In just what quarter, he did not remember, and had been stricken immediately by an overwhelming desire to possess it. Party members were supposed to not go into ordinary shops, dealing on the free market, it was called, but the rule was not strictly kept, because there were various things such as shoelaces and razor blades, which it was impossible to get a hold of in any other way. He had given a quick glance up and down the street and slipped in by the book for $2.50. At the time he was not conscious of wanting it for any particular purpose. He had carried it guiltily home in his briefcase, even with nothing on it. It was a compromising possession. The thing he was about to do was open a diary. This was not illegal. Nothing was illegal, since there were no longer any laws. But if detected, it was reasonably certain that it would be punished by death or at least 25 years in a forced labor camp. Winston fitted a nib into the pen holder and sucked it to get the grease off. The pen was an archaic instrument, seldom used even for signatures. He had procured one furtively, with some difficulty, simply because of the feeling that the creamy paper deserved to be well written on with a real nib instead of being scratched with an ink pencil. Actually, he was not used to writing by hand. Apart from very short notes, it was usual to dictate everything into the speakwrite, which was of course impossible for his present purpose. He dipped the pen into the ink, and then faltered just for a second. A tremor had gone through his bowels. To mark the paper was the decisive act. In small, clumsy letters he wrote, April 4th, 1984. He sat back in a complete sense of helplessness had descended upon him. To begin with, he did not know of any certainty this was 1984. It must be around that date, since he was fairly sure that that his age was 39, and he had believed he had been born in 1944 or 1945. But it was never possible to pin down any date within a year or two. For whom it suddenly occurred to him to wonder, was he writing this diary for the future, for the unborn? His mind hovered for a moment round the doubtful date on the page, and then fetched up with a bump against the newspeak word, doublethink. For the first time, the magnitude of what he had undertaken came home to him. How could you communicate with the future? It was of its nature impossible. Either the future would resemble the present, in which case it would not listen to him, or it would be different from it, and his predicament would be meaningless. For some time he sat gazing stupidly at the paper. The telescreen had changed over to strident military music. It was curious that he seemed not merely to have lost the power of expressing himself, but to have even forgotten what it was that he originally intended to say. For weeks past he had been making ready for this moment. It had never crossed his mind that anything would be needed except courage. The actual writing would be easy. All he had to do was transfer the thoughts into an interminable, restless monologue that had been ruining inside his head, literally for years. At this moment, however, even the monologue had dried up. Moreover, his varicose ulcer had begun itching unbearably. He dared not scratch it, because if he did, it would always become inflamed. The seconds were ticking by. He was conscious of nothing except the blankness of the page in front of you. The itching skin above his ankle, the blaring of the music, and the slight booziness caused by the gin. Suddenly, he began writing in sheer panic, only imperfectly aware what he was setting down. His small but childish handwriting straggled up and down the page, shedding its first capital letters, and finally leaving its full stops. April 4th, 1984. Last night to the flicks. All war films. One very good of a ship, full of refugees being bombed somewhere in the Mediterranean. Audience was much amused by shots of great, huge, fat man trying to swim away with a helicopter after him. First, you saw him wallowing along water like a porpoise. Then you saw him through the helicopter gunshites. Then he was full of holes, and the sea round him turned pink, and he sank suddenly as through the holes had let in the water. Audience shouting with laughter. When he sank, then you saw a lifeboat full of children, with a helicopter hovering over it. There was a middle-aged woman who might have been a Jewess sitting up in the bow, with a little boy about 3 years old, in her arms. The little boy screaming with fright and hiding his head between her breasts as if he was trying to burrow right into her, and the woman putting her arms around him to comfort him, although she was blue with fright herself, all the time covering up as much as possible as if she thought her arms could keep bullets off him. Then the helicopter planted a 20-kilo bomb among them, a terrific blast, a terrific flash, and the boat all went under to Matchwood. Then there was a wonderful shot of a child's arm going up right into the air. A helicopter with its camera on its nose must have followed, and there was a lot of applause from the party seats, but a woman down in the parole part of the house suddenly started kicking up a fuss, shouting they didn't oughter. It showed not in front of the kids. They ain't right, not in front of the kids. It ain't until the police turned her out. I don't suppose anything happened to her. Nobody cares what the parole say. Typical parole reaction. Winston stopped writing. Partly because he knew he was suffering from cramp. He did not know what had made him pour out this stream of rubbish. But the curious thing, while he was doing so, a totally different memory. It had clarified itself in his own mind. It was now, he realized, because of this other incident that he suddenly decided to come home and begin his diary today. It had happened that morning at the ministry. If anything so nebulous could be said to happen. It was nearly 1100 in the records department where Winston worked. They were dragging the chairs out of the cubicles and grouping them in the center hall opposite the big telescreen in preparation for the 2 minutes hate. Winston was just taking his place in one of the middle rows when people whom he knew by sight but had never spoken to came unexpectedly into the room. One of them was a girl who he often passed in the corridors. He did not know her name, but he knew that she worked in the fiction department, presumably since he had sometimes seen her with oily hands and carrying a spanner. She had some mechanical job of the novel-writing machines. She was a bold-looking girl of about 27, with thick dark hair, a freckled face, and swift athletic movements. A narrow scarlet slash, emblem of the Junior Anti-Sex League, was wound several times around the waist of her overalls, just tightly enough to bring out the shapelessness of her hips. Winston had disliked her from the very first moment of seeing her. He knew the reason was because of the atmosphere of hockey fields and cold baths, and community hikes and general clean-mindedness which she managed to carry with her. He disliked nearly all women, especially the young and pretty ones. It was always the women, above all, the young ones, who were the most bigoted adherents of the party, the swallowers of slogans, the amateur spies, and nosers out of unorthodoxy. But this particular girl gave him the impression of being more dangerous than most. Once they had passed into the corridor, she had given him a quick sidelong glance, in which she seemed to pierce right into him. For a moment, he had filled him with black terror. The idea had even crossed his mind that she might be an agent of the thought police. That it was untrue was very unlikely. Still, he continued to feel a peculiar uneasiness, in which fear had mixed up in it as well as hostility. Whenever she was anywhere near him, The other person was a man named O'Brien, a member of the Inner Party, and a holder of some post so important and remote that Winston had only a dim idea of its nature. A momentary hush passed over a group of people. Through the chairs, they saw black overalls of an Inner Party member approaching O'Brien. With a large, burly man, thick neck, and a coarse, humorous, brutal face. In spite of his formidable appearances, he had a certain charm of the manner. He had a trick resettling his spectacles on his nose, which was curiously disarming, in some indefinable way. Curiously civilized, it was a gesture which, if anyone had been thought such terms, might have recalled an 18th century nobleman offering a snuff box. Winston had seen O'Brien perhaps a dozen times in almost as many years. He felt deeply drawn to him, and not solely because he was intrigued by the contrast between O'Brien's urbane manner and his prizefighter's physique. Much more, it was because of a secretly held belief, or perhaps not even a belief, merely a hope O'Brien's political orthodoxy was not perfect. Something in his face suggested it irresistibly. And again, perhaps, it was not even unorthodoxy that was written in his face, but simply intelligence. But at any rate, he had the appearance of being a person that you could talk to. If somehow you could cheat the telescreen and get him alone, Winston had never made the smallest effort to verify this guess. Indeed, there was no way of doing so. At this moment, O'Brien glanced at his wristwatch and saw that it was nearly 1100, and evidently decided to stay in the records department until 2 minutes' hate was over. He took the chair in the same row as Winston, a couple places away. A small, sandy-haired woman who worked in the next cubicle to Winston was between them. The girl with the dark hair was sitting immediately behind. The next moment, a hideous, grinding screech, as some monstrous machine running without oil burst from the big telescreen. At the end of the room, it was a noise that set one's teeth on edge and bristled the hair at the back guard. The hate had started. As usual, the face of Emmanuel Goldstein, the enemy of the people, had flashed onto the screen. There were hisses here and among the audience. The little sandy-haired woman gave a squeak of mingled fear and disgust. Goldstein was the renegade and backslider who once, how long ago, nobody quite remembered, had been one of the leading figures of the party, almost on a level with Big Brother himself. And then he engaged in counter-revolutionary activities and had been condemned to death, and had mysteriously escaped and disappeared. The programs of 2 Minutes Hate varied from day to day, but there was none in which Goldstein was not the principal figure. He was the primal traitor, the earliest defiler of the party's purity. All subsequent crimes against the parties, all treacheries, acts of sabotage, heresies, deviations, sprang directly out of the teaching. Somewhere the other was still entaching his conspiracies, perhaps beyond the sea, under the protection of his foreign paymasters, perhaps even occasionally hiding somewhere in Oceania himself. Alright, that's going to be it for this. It is midway through page 12 if you want to pick up the book yourself.